Of all the great U.S. states, the biggest one is by far Alaska. Encompassing half of the USA's coastline, it is larger than many European cities, but its population is only around 730,000. Before this, the territory was actually a colony of the Russian Empire and populated by several native tribes that lived there for thousands of years. But in 1867, the territory was bought by America and eventually it became a state. Yet, what might have happened if this purchase never occurred? What if America never bought Alaska? First, here's some context. At the time, what we now know as Alaska was called Russian America and had been a colony of Russia since 1741. The Russians never used the vast economic resources there, and the colony was much more of a prestige rather than a colony they actually used. The main reason Russia had given up Alaska was because of its loss in the Crimean War. The empire was bankrupt and the Russian navy was battered, so Tsar Alexander II knew a reform was needed before Russia could enter conflict with another nation. This was when the Tsar's brother, Grand Duke Constantine, who wanted to reform the empire, suggested selling off Alaska to earn some cash. Alexander agreed with this idea, but initially didn't know who to sell it to. Britain owned Canada that was already right next to Alaska, and they had signed several treaties with Russia that allowed them to navigate the waters around it. However, both nations just fought each other and continued to contend in the Middle East and Asia during an event known as the Great Game, so selling land this close to Russia itself was seen as dangerous. Additionally, the British weren't all that interested, so another possible contender was the United States. Russia previously offered Alaska to the US in 1857. However, with the American Civil War seeming inevitable, they were turned down. After the war, with the issues that had been popping up in Reconstruction, purchasing Alaska seemed like a good way to extend America's power on the world stage. It was already believed that this purchase could solidify a Russo-American alliance. Russia sent surveys to inspect the land, but instead they returned it and said Russia shouldn't sell the territory at all, and instead change its governance. Alexander was stuck arguing with two groups of people, and eventually he decided to sell Alaska to the Americans. So in March of 1867, William H. Seward and Edward Stoeckel began negotiations for the purchase of Alaska. However, the American public believed the land to be barren and worthless, so Seward's Folly became a nickname for the purchase. Some animosity toward the project may have been a byproduct of President Johnson's own unpopularity, as Johnson battled with radical Republicans in Congress over Reconstruction policies following the Civil War. Nevertheless, Congress eventually ratified the Alaska deal and Russia was paid $7.2 million. The Senate approved it 37-2 and the House did the same 113-43. Public opinion of the purchase turned more favorable and gold was discovered in Alaska in 1899, sparking the Klondike Gold Rush. After a while as a territory, Alaska became the 49th state on January 3, 1959, and is now recognized for its vast natural resources. Today, 25% of America's oil and over 50% of its seafood come from Alaska. But what might have happened if none of this happened and America never bought Alaska? This video is going to be different, where instead of focusing on one central timeline, I'm going to cover three different possibilities on what might have happened. These will all be of varying plausibility, but first, we need to lay the groundwork for the scenario. William H. Seward was the mastermind behind the U.S. purchasing Alaska, as much of the government and population didn't approve of it. So if he hadn't been able to offer his services, then it's unlikely the purchase would have occurred. In 1865, when President Lincoln was killed by John Wilkes Booth, it was actually part of a larger Booth conspiracy to decapitate the Union government. It was planned for Secretary of State Seward and Vice President Andrew Johnson to be killed as well. Booth's friend, Lewis Powell, was in charge of killing Seward, who then was sick in bed from an injury. Powell entered his home and said he was sent by Seward's doctor to give him medicine. However, Seward's son, Frederick Seward, didn't believe this, causing Powell to run upstairs and stab Seward in bed. In our timeline, he failed to kill him, but in this alternate timeline, Powell successfully murdered Seward. With Seward dead, he no longer would be Secretary of State and couldn't work with the Johnson administration to buy Alaska. While this could cause other effects to Reconstruction, we aren't going to focus on that. Because of this, Tsar Alexander II is more swayed to keep control of Alaska by his advisors, and ultimately decides not to sell the territory. So, what changes? Well, in reality, not much. Russia could change the governance of the colony, such as building an economy off of whaling around the coast, but overall, it wouldn't have much of a change. So by 1868, I'm going to start splitting the scenario off into three parts, starting with in this timeline, if the Americans don't have interest in Alaska, then it's likely the British do instead. With a higher population, the British could easily mobilize forces near Alaska to a much higher degree than the Russians could. This could initially start with the dispute over the Alaskan Panhandle that had been a point of contention since 1825. In this alternate timeline, the British occupied the Panhandle and through negotiations would force the Russians to cede all land south of the town of Yucatan. The Russians wouldn't be able to militarily oppose this, and thus, events like this would continue. Over the years, British miners enter Alaska and mine the resources there. An influx of British settlers outnumber local Russians, and the Canadian government strengthens its treaties with Russia, allowing for domination of the waters around the area. Finally, in 1904, after Russia began war with Japan, the British saw this as an opportunity and marched into Alaska. Being focused on the Japanese, Russia doesn't do anything to stop this encroachment. while the British intervene on the side of Japan. The Russian fleet is decimated and they suffer worse losses in the war. In 1905, at the end of the war, Britain was permitted to keep Alaska in exchange for paying small reparations to Russia. A few years later, Alaska would have been a full part of Canada. From here, not much would change, though the economy of Canada would very likely be boosted through mining. With much more focus on mining, the upper territories of Yukon and Nunavut could become provinces sooner with a higher population than our timeline. Throughout World War I and World War II, the British used Alaska and the coast of British Columbia as ports for their Pacific Fleet. In the rest of Canada, with the larger size of the country, Newfoundland may take a longer time to join Canada. In our timeline, they stayed separate for over 100 years due to economic issues, so it's possible they just stayed an independent dominion and later their own nation. Overall, in the end, this timeline is very similar to our own, with not much changing outside of Canada. So now we go on to... Now this timeline asks if Russia decided to keep Alaska for themselves and actually dedicate resources to its development. This could come in the 1870s, where reforms would sweep right through the Russian state. As part of these reforms, Tsar Alexander II decides to dissolve the Russian-American Company and turn Alaska into a more direct part of Russia. One of Alexander's reforms was called C.V.M, which helped build up local governments. In Alaska, these reforms allow a small wave of Russian farmers to move to the territory, along with a population of natives and North Americans. The Russian population would be able to build up the small settlements into forts and ports, which would allow more communication between Alaska and Siberia. Despite this, Alexander II would still be assassinated in 1881 and be succeeded by Alexander III, who would likely scale back civil liberties and reforms in Alaska. Whether or not these tensions caused some kind of Alaskan rebellion, it would likely fail. By the early 1900s, the Russo-Japanese War still occurred, and despite owning Alaska, there wouldn't really be much of a difference. Combat in the North Pacific is much more brutal, and large masses of Alaska's small population are sent to fight. The loss in this war would not only be embarrassing for the government, but the tensions would cause Alaskans to despise the empire more and more. Then, with the start of World War I, Russia's navy is again active in the Pacific. While some more troops would be supplied via Alaska, but still, the empire would lose the war, and with the start of the Russian Civil War, Alaska seizes the opportunity and declares independence. Tsar Nicholas II and the royal government would attempt to retake Alaska, but after Nicholas abdicated in July, this would be stopped. Following the Bolshevik victory, thousands of White Army soldiers flee to Alaska. After the war, the Democratic Alaskan Republic was formed, supported by the Canadians and Americans. However, unlike former Russian republics, the Bolsheviks couldn't invade Alaska due to their lack of naval domination. So during the interwar period, the Alaskan government begins drilling into their territory and finds vast resources of oil, untapped previously. Using this, the Republic solidifies its alliances and ensures their industrialization and modernization. However, with the Great Depression, Alaska would be struck hard, having an economy very close to the Americans and British. Inflation and homelessness strike the young nation, while internationally, they begin to be isolated, as while many other countries finally recognized the Soviet regime, Alaska would refrain from doing so. By World War II, this crucial small nation would be teetering on joining either side. If Alaska were to join the Axis, then I have severe doubts they could defeat the Soviets. Also, the Japanese likely don't invade the Aleutian Islands, so Alaska isn't under any immediate threat. So in this timeline, Alaska remains neutral and only joins at the end of the conflict to secure a seat in the United Nations. With the beginning of the Cold War, Alaska would join NATO and become a firm ally of the West, while the Bering Strait becomes a highly contested region. Without much more effects, the Cold War ends just the same, and in the modern day, Alaska remains an independent nation. While the Russian Federation could look to reunify with it, it's very unlikely, so their relationship would be very similar to that of China and Taiwan today. And at last, we reach... Okay, do not take this scenario seriously, I chose this one for fun. Let's say the Russians still keep Alaska, but it still remains on the backwater up until the 1890s. With the death of Alexander III, he was succeeded by his son, Nicholas II, in 1894, who not only gained sway over a massive empire, but also Alaska. The same year, Japan wins a massive victory over China in the First Sino-Japanese War. The Japanese invaded Korea and were very close to capturing Beijing. But in our timeline, France, Russia, and Germany worked together to help China and contain Japanese expansionism. In this timeline, Nicholas II and his finance minister, Sergei Witt, instead seek to ally with Japan. This leads to Russia backing Japan and eventually forcing France and Germany to back down. Japan annexed Korea and the Liaodong Peninsula while forcing China to pay war reparations. Additionally, Russia was given a port on the peninsula that they would lease out to Japan. This event leads to the foundations of a Russo-Japanese alliance, and it also means that the Lee-Libanov Treaty is never signed and Russo-Chinese relations never form into their own alliance. A few years later, in the 1900s, the Russians would look to expand directly into Manchuria. However, they wouldn't want to break relations with Japan, so the Russians make a deal that if the Japanese allow Russia to take over Manchuria, then Japan can gain ownership of Alaska. Now, this deal would be very strange, and I can imagine the Russians accepting any price they could get from Japan. But regardless, the Japanese agreed in exchange for the Kuril Islands and some ports in Kamchatka, and they will pay Russia. So, by 1901, Japan owned Alaska. What changes? Well, this decision would initially be very confusing and unpopular in Japan. The territory is very far away, and it's unlikely a number of Japanese farmers are going to move all the way to barren Alaska. If anything, Japan would be the one to sell Alaska in this timeline, but let's just say Japan decides to keep it and the Kuril Islands along with its ports in Kamchatka. Well, with such a large territory, it would likely be run similar to how New France was run. Japanese businessmen and politicians would live in and run from cities and ports, while the rest of the land is controlled by natives, miners, and former Russians. The Japanese Navy would pretty much have to be expanded to keep control of the territory. I doubt the Japanese population in Alaska would even get that high, but that would all change when the Japanese discovered the resources of Alaska, such as gold and, crucially, oil. This would cause a wave of Japanese migrants to travel to Alaska, but more crucially, it would make Japan a lot richer. At this point, the Americans and Canadians would still be very freaked out by this purchase. Obviously, the Russo-Japanese War doesn't happen, which means Japan never had the opportunity to show the world it was a major power. So from America's perspective, some minor Asian nation established a foothold on the continent and stopped you from dominating the Pacific. Worse, in World War I, the Japanese would seize German colonies, putting them even closer to America. During the Russian Civil War, the Japanese would intervene much more on the side of the White Army, so during the war, the military intervened in Siberia, possibly with British support. I doubt this extra money and support would do anything, but for the sake of the video, let's just say this increased support brings about a ceasefire hosted by the British and Japanese, during which the Bolsheviks gain control of Russia, while the White Army is allowed to set up its own state east of the Lena River. Following this, the Japanese would enter the interwar period as the foremost power of the Pacific. Relations are much better with Russia and Japan, leaving Britain much more left out and focusing on an alliance with America. And these tensions would be made worse if Japan chose to dock many powerful ships and put aircraft forces in Alaska, right next to America. So at this point, the Japanese have a large amount of resources for themselves, so it's possible they won't end up going on a conquest spree in the South Pacific. The expanded Japanese Navy would patrol the North Pacific and ensure their domination. But since you're all curious, let's just say Japan still goes on their conquering spree in China and later Asia. With the resources of their Navy and Army, they will be able to act more swiftly. With this, when the attack on Pearl Harbor occurs, the Americans are hit harder, and the Japanese are not only able to surround Midway and Hawaii, but possibly launch their own invasions of both, though this is debatable. If White Russia gets involved on Japan's side, then they could join Germany in their invasion of the USSR and attack British colonies in Asia. At this point, World War II is so much more expansive that I don't know what to predict. At this point, it's hard to say what might happen next, as this third scenario seems so implausible that it's almost like saying fiction. But anyways, I hope y'all enjoyed this video, and please like and subscribe. Tell me what other broad topics I should do in this video style, and if you want me to keep doing it. Until then, this has been the Cooper Chronicles. Bye!